coffee, drinks, something to eat. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Anne-Marie May. I'm a professor of Nordic literature, and I'm very engaged with a research project called Uses of Literature, where we are so lucky that Professor Wittefelsky is our next door professor, and she's here for 5 years, half of the year. And we started the project, it was last year, and we were so lucky that one of my very dear colleagues, Moritz Schramm, Associate Professor Moritz Schramm, agreed to join our project and to take part in the development of uses of literature. And this is a great advantage for us because he's a specialist in German literature. For a number of years he has worked with one of our major concepts, the concept of recognition. What does recognition mean in literary studies? The recognition of the readers, their way of using literary works. And he has written a number of excellent journal articles, also monographs on German literature and comparison, also into comparative literature. So it was such a great pleasure for us that he would participate in our project, and he has already contributed. He's one of the leaders of a major research project on post-migration financed by the National Research Council, the Free National Research Council of Denmark, and it's such an interesting project on post-migration. And of course, this is also very important to us in uses of literature, this topic of the post-migration. And yeah, I'm happy that he's here, and I hope that you'll give him a warm welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Introduction, Anne-Marie. And of course, it's my pleasure to be part of the group that you want me in the group today on the uses of literature. As Anne-Marie was saying, I will today not so much speak about neither recognition or uses of literature. Would be happy to discuss all those things afterwards. But I will mainly focus on the other projects that Anne-Marie mentioned, post-migration stuff. And just to give you a brief idea about the setting, we got funded in 2016 for, what I'm saying now? I think we have 3 years, isn't it? 16, 17, 18, that's it. So we're kind of approaching as a research group, we have about the second half of our funding period. We are writing currently a monograph, co-authored monograph with seven writers together in one book, writing on every single thing together, which is quite a funny project, quite difficult. But the whole thing is about post-migration and the arts culture. The group consists of, besides me, 7 other researchers, which come from different universities in Denmark, and from different fields inside of the humanities. That means we have people from art history, we have people from literature studies, and so on, like kind of a broad field. And I have the pleasure to be the one who's kind of trying to keep the group together. Always kind of difficult stuff. That's great. And so what I'm trying to do today is to talk a little bit about the concept of post-migration. Some actually inside the research field reject the term post-migration. They insist on talk about post-migrant perspectives. I do a little bit both of it, and there are a lot of discussions which I would not take today, but again in the discussion.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
On humanism, what's the main difference with post-migration and post-migrant?
I'll come back to it. I mean, this is a simple thing. I'll not go into all the detailed discussion inside of the field, but
I apologize for my ignorance.
But the main thing is that people would say post, kind of course, it's a temporal division. I mean, a temporal distinction, of course. Something after, but also it kind of keeps it, there's some kind of distance to the term before in a post-term. And post-migration, what people say, do you lay distance to migration as such? And of course we don't, as a research group. Post-migrant would mean that this distance would go to the label of the migrant, described identity. But I will come a little bit back to it later, maybe a little bit, otherwise you ask again in the end, if I need some time for that. Well, let's start with an interview. In an early interview this year, and I quote a little bit from this interview, the political scientist Naika Forutan, who is professor at Humboldt University in Berlin, she was, when she was interviewed in a newspaper in Germany, she was complimented with the Siegeszug, the triumph march of the post-migrant society, the term post-migrant society. The concept of post-migrant society, which is the foundation of your scientific work, the interviewer starts out, has had a rapid rise, Blitzkarriere. Many, he continues, are hoping that finally a term has been found which adequately describes a society and provides a good basis for visionary outlines for the future. So the whole thing about here is that people would say this is a term we're discussing now in Germany, this is a new term, post-migrant society here, yet another term, to open up discussions about where we are today in society. And of course, Naika Forutan, when she's kind of confronted with the compliments, she's the one labeling this term of the post-migrant society. He would reject those compliments and kind of put them further to Schramm. Just give you a brief picture. I don't have many slides, so it's not, well, I have many slides. I don't use many slides, so I believe a few of them. But she kind of referred back to Schramm and said, well, the congratulations, Naika Forutan answers, must go to Schramm, who has introduced the concept in her artistic work as a subversive, ironic counter-concept in order to make clear that Germany, it's our German context we're talking about, does not consist of the groups migrants and non-migrants, but of many different groups of persons supporting each other or positioning each other in opposition to one another. And here again we're coming about the discussion about what is post-migration, post-migrant. Here it's about the rejection of the label as a migrant in public discourse, somehow as part of it. But Naika Forutan here referring to Schramm is kind of referring back to the artistic background of the term. It's coming from the art and cultural scene in Berlin, where people started to use the label of post-migrant stuff, post-migrant theater, as a self-labeling function in their own work. And Naika Forutan then continued the interview that she and her colleagues just have transferred the concept to social sciences and try to operationalize it. A process which is challenging, she said. The arts, I quote a little bit more from the interview, the arts and cultural scene can use a concept without defining it in detail. But we as researchers must define our concepts, fix them, build models. In this process of appropriation, there always is a risk, Forutan continues, that parts of this subversive force get lost. On the other side, there could be the possibility to use the concept productively in scientific research by working with it and accepting the complexity and ambiguity included in the term. So what's about here is that Naika Forutan kind of put the congratulations back to the art scene, at the same moment saying we have a problem here, a challenge, when we try to transfer, not defined subversive concept from the art scene back into academic scientific work. And this is what then happens in the next 10, 15 years. We're talking about last 10, 15 years where the whole concept kind of evolved, at least in German context, where people in academic world try to define the term, try to use the term, and struggling with, at the same time, with the kind of the opening to the art scene, the cultural scene, which kind of use it as a subversive critical concept. And how do those things come together? Of course, I would argue that the whole concept here, this kind of interrelations, interchange between art and culture and academic world, of course, is productive. And I think it kind of helps us to kind of go back to what we're talking about somehow. And what I want to do today, kind of following up on this, is two things. I will first look back into the background of the term, how it emerged in the first place, where it comes from in the art and cultural scene, give you some broad ideas. Of course, time is limited, but give some ideas of the background. And then in the second step, I will discuss if and possibly how the concept can offer new perspectives, influencing our way of looking at issues like migration, immigration, integration in social and cultural research. How can we use this kind of concept? obviously, when I ask if we can use the term, I would not be here if I would not believe we can, obviously. And when I talked about the headline of the title of my lecture, I created a question mark. It disappeared on the posters. I think it's actually fine because, of course, I think there's a new perspective included in those kind of things. And that's what I want to talk about. But let me just go back and talk a little bit, some minutes about the historical background, where it comes from. And the concept from post-migration actually shows up, to kind of open a little bit up for complexity here, shows up in scientific academic works in the 90s. Baumann, Sunyer, Triesman, and others are using the concept in the 90s, but it somehow didn't make any impact. You can see, especially in social sciences, you can still today see articles using the word of the post-immigration generation, anything, referring obviously to people who are not migrated themselves, but would be descendants, second, third generation immigrants. This use has been around and is around. But what we're talking about here is a different kind of conceptualization. And that started when Schramm still have her here, put the term on the agenda in the beginning of the 21st century, some years ago. She introduced the concept already during the festival Europe in Motion in 2004. Schramm comes from film, literary field, whatever. When she was working in a publishing house a little bit, then she started to work with Fatih Akin. Some of you may know the films of Fatih Akin. She started as a production assistant there in Head-On, Gegen die Wand, which won the Berlinale and so on. So she was involved in different fields and then turned to the theater. And in 2004, the first festival she organized, Europe in Motion, was very much about movies and films still in the Berlin setting here. Inviting young people, combining art production, sound production, and modern video installation and movies, actually, film productions in Europe in Motion. At this first festival, Europe in Motion, they already started to talk about the concept of post-migration, or post-migrant art, I would say. In 2006, and that makes this kind of background story a bit short here, another festival, Beyond Belonging, influential in Berlin art scene. They kind of get together a lot of people from different art circles and again at a big theater in Berlin and started to kind of discuss those things. In 2008, that's the main, one Beyond Belonging thing, here from 2006, the major breakthrough was the Ballhaus Nauninstraße, which was a very small independent theater. Nobody knew it before. In the in the multicultural area, you would normally call it Berlin-Kreuzberg. A lot of descendants from guest workers living there. A lot of students, those kind of areas. Berlin-Kreuzberg, many of you may have been there. And in 2008, Schramm together with some others, Gensilian, Tonchai Kongolu, and others, they took over, so to speak, the Ballhaus Nauninstraße. They made a deal with the local authorities and started their own theater. They started the theater under the label of the post-migrant theater, and this label, she later in interviews explained it as a kind of self-labeling. I mean, everybody puts labels on us. She said, we would be the migrants, we would be the ones making migrant theater, so why don't we invent our own labels and call it post-migrant theater? A bit provocative, again, because everybody was saying you're making migrant theater, because you're descendants from migrants. I mean, Schramm was born in Turkey, and a lot of the people, not everybody, but a lot of the people around this Ballhaus, of course, there would have different backgrounds. Quite a couple of them would have backgrounds in Turkey, Italy, Russia, and whatever. So what they did, they overtook the theater 2008, gave it the label Post-Migrant Theater, and just very, very shortly after, in the next 2 or 3 years, it was a huge success. First in Berlin, like everybody started to talk about this small independent theater that was sold out all the time. Obviously, like it often is, in the beginning, there was the local people going there. After 1 or 2 years, all the academics, teachers from schools would go there because there's something happening here, something interesting. High quality theater, challenging, innovative, and very successful. The label helped. The label was part of the kind of getting out and saying, we are doing something new. We're not doing migrant literature. We're not doing migrant theater. We are post-migrant. Nobody really knew what they meant, but it was new. And what helped. And until today, and when I kind of meet with researchers in the field, academics talking, using the term, all the discussions coming up, nobody knows exactly what we want to say with the term. It's not true, of course, a lot of definitions. But just opening the discussion by getting the distance to the old use of terms like migrant and other things, extremely productive. I mean, we're always coming back to say, like, well, if we don't kind of keep on using the old terminology, if we want to use new terminology, post-migration, then we have to reframe the things and we have to rediscuss the things. So I've been in this field for quite some years in the kind of academic world, and those discussions are the most interesting discussions I've ever seen. I mean, it's really getting always to the point here. However, they got success, huge success, and Matt Blood and other pieces. I think maybe have some posters. This kind of, this kind of avant-garde theater somehow in a high quality. It's not kind of, it's professional, very mixed ensemble, obviously, and mixing all gender issues and everything into it. You can imagine those kind of theater. And I have some trailers, but I will not show them now. I can make them find them later. What's happened then, just to kind of go on this kind of very simple background story, is that, well, actually, the local governments in Berlin were not really aware of the success. It was a huge success, but they kind of didn't react on it. So Schramm and I on the way to Vienna, where she got promised a big kind of position in a big theater. And when this kind of get public, that she was on her way to leave Berlin, there was a huge outcry in the cultural scene. So how can we, as a city, as Berlin city, kind of not react on this? How can it be that she's leaving the city, who's one of the most innovative person and having huge success in the city? So suddenly the local government kind of redecided and offered her actually the smallest, but still one of the state-funded theaters. This is independent theater. The next one she took over in 2012. It's the Gorki Theater, Maxim Gorki Theater in the center of Berlin, unter den Linden. As I said, state-funded, not independent, a stable ensemble, and some millions of euros every year. It's a different setting. Now she's up in the mainstream, so to speak. And the story continues. The Maxim Gorki Theater, just after she took over, together with Jens Silje, she's always joking, the Turk and the gay. Jens Silje is gay, and she is kind of Turkish background, so they too kind of getting the thing up. But the Maxim Gorki Theater is today maybe the most discussed theater in whole Berlin, maybe whole Germany. Just some couple of years after she took over, the first thing she did, I think it's a good anecdote, a lot of people do this when they overtake theaters, when they get kind of director position. But what she did was kind of hiring 60–70% of the staff. So it's not like we're coming, everything is nice. Throwing people out because she wants her own people in. And her own people, of course, actively, you can imagine, people of color, different backgrounds. Said, well, where are those people in the theater scene? There's nobody. So we have to gate them. We have to build our own institutions, which I did in Kreuzberg, and now we overtake the mainstream institution. That was the thing. And to overtake the mainstream institutions, of course, we have to get rid of the old traditions, so to speak. So this is struggle from the beginning, as those things here. And just to give you an idea of what they kind of come from when they started the whole thing. What they were saying was, in the beginning, obviously, and I think you can imagine this point, that they say there was voices lacking. That's a classical story of lack of representation. And they were saying 60 years after the beginning of the so-called Gastworker immigration to Germany, it's again a quotation from Schramm Langhoff. Langhoff says, migrant protagonists have barely got access to the theater world, so they can tell their own stories and other stories from their own perspectives. Stories of migration experiences were either completely neglected or told from a privileged majority perspective. We were simply lacking text stories. Tunçay Kogolu remembers stories that haven't been told on stage yet, and obviously not from the perspective they want. This is kind of the old story. You know the story about representation struggles to get in and change those things. And this is very much about institutionalization. I mean, building up institutions, as I said before. When they started the festivals, Europe in Motion and Beyond Belonging, they quite fast understood that these festivals are nice and interesting, but we have to go into the institutions. We have to institutionalize those things. We have to get out of the shadow of the dominant cultural discourse and add translocal perspectives, which are not self-evident yet, to the privileged institutions. There was, of course, this critical political dimension in it. As political activists, Tunçay Kogolu remembers, as political activists, we consciously turn to the art as means to mobilize people. This is how I began. If you want to change the world, then you take art as a means and medium for doing this. You don't found a political party. I think not to disagree on this, but that's kind of the ambitions they come from. Interesting for the things I'm going over now to the academic discussions here in a second, obviously is that the intention those people had from the very beginning was to break the minority discourse, as I called it. So this was not about identity politics, at least not in the first place. Of course, there's always a level of identity politics in it. Jens Hildy remembered when they overtook the Ballhaus-Noninstraße in 2008. Of course, this is not longer a suitable position that the minority remains a minority. We have to get a step further. The whole country must, he continues, be rearranged and changed. The identity, as it is collectively framed and negotiated, must be changed so that the future becomes different, more open than it was in the 90s. So this is an important little point, but it's an important point for me, that of course ambition was not like we making our own minority identity politics here, but we are going into the institutions to change the whole concept of what Germany is, so to speak. And this is ambitious, of course, but I would even argue it somehow worked out so far. Of course, not the whole way. And of course they're part of the broad movement and whatever. But I didn't have a picture now, but just recently you could see that the Ministry of Family Ministry in Germany put a new agenda on their website, saying in a post-market society we have to open for participation and everything. So like we manage and make a Photon is very, very good in labeling, what's called influence on political level. So they're trying to get on the federal government level to get those things implemented now. That's interesting what they're doing. I mean, they're quite tough. When I still keep on the historical background just for a second, very briefly, obviously it doesn't come from nothing, that kind of attempt to overtalk the theater. In the 90s in Germany, we have seen quite strong networking groups who kind of rejected, there was, of course, like everywhere in Europe, upcoming nationalism, xenophobia in the beginning of the 90s in Germany. I don't know whether you remember, but there was quite heavy things going on, refugees from Yugoslavia coming and struggles there. And so in the middle of the 90s, as a reaction against it, there would be network groups founded who would kind of reject, would kind of fight, the agenda was to fight racism, simply. And one of the most influential movements, networks, was Kanaka Tak. The interesting thing with Kanaka Tak movement is the one thing that most of the researchers I'm working today nowadays coming from the Kanaka Tak movement when they were young. They kind of become professor later, and they're kind of following up on the agenda. There's a direct line from activist, artistic levels to academic world. It's an interesting line to follow how it, one could even talk about the network theory and everything here. But the interesting thing with Kanaka Tak movement is they were influential at that time, of course, on a kind of avant-garde level, but they rejected, they were very aggressive in saying when we want to reject racism and kind of classical nationalistic xenophobia, then we have to challenge the whole concept of the foreigner, the migrant, and multiculturalism and everything. The term multiculturalism, which is quite, of course, still around in the English-speaking world, has been completely rejected from the German leftist activists in the 80s and 90s. And there's not a discussion what's going on here. But obviously those people in the Kanaka Tak movement, they wrote manifests and things were saying, of course, we will reject multicultural politics, we reject a dialogue between cultures, we reject every form of tolerance towards a foreigner, and so on and so on. And why would they do that? Simply enough, you can imagine, because the dialogue between culture, has the idea behind that there would be two cultures that can go in dialogue with each other. And obviously, when you want to be tolerant to the foreigners, then you reproduce the concept that the foreigner is not kind of part of you, so to speak, of the society. This is quite simple, but it was in the 90s innovative and somehow shocking, at least for some people. And they were aggressive, those people. I mean, in a good way. Aggressive, I just mean like, that was not talking, that was like, we don't want you to label me as anything, it was really kind of empowerment politics, and they kind of went quite far. Kanaka Tak is anti-nationalist, right, anti-racist, and rejects every single form for identity politics. Kanaka Tak is not interested in questions about your passport or heritage. In fact, it challenges such questions in the first place. So it's not about where you come from, it's about which attitude, which position you have in the world. Again, this may be kind of understandable for everybody here in the 90s, that was kind of an attempt to counter-argue the idea of a tolerant, nice, multicultural politics, accepting the other as the other. And they kind of took another step in saying we don't want to be accepted as the other because we are no other. At least we want to talk about the processes of othering, how you kind of present us as the other and everything, which is a different step. So the whole thing is now how do we come from here, from Kanaka-Tak, who then directly influenced the academic circles in the post-migrant field today, working on this field today, influencing the German government on their agenda.
Oh, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's a very interesting concept, right? I totally agree that it's nice to eliminate any kind of reference to the difference. But I've lived in the States for about 8 years, and every time I had to do a tax return, I had to do a tax return called non-resident alien.
Yeah,
So that probably goes exactly against the Nakatak principles, right? You would never have to eventually write the tax return with the non-resident alien on it.
I mean, one of the first pieces they made in Ballhaus-Nonnenstraße, Schwarze Jungfrauen, Black Virgins, were kind of showing Muslim women monologues, kind of stripped off, no weird, nothing, just naked, you know, and it's showed like this, making monologues on their fundamentalistic view on society and everything. Of course, very ironic, very aggressive. The whole thing was played with, you know, all what's it called, the Encounter 5 thing, the Spielberg movie, what's it called, the Encounter of whatever, you know. This is a kind of a melody going through. And this melody, I come back to your point.
But how far was in Germany this actually movement had such an impact? Right? I mean, I can see Germany is pretty advanced.
No, I mean, it's not really the point how far Germany is. The point is those people try to change Germany. I would not say they're quite succeeded yet, but they have influence. What I'm trying to say here is what they used as the first thing is a melody from Spielberg's movie of the encounter of the 5th grade or whatever it's called. Exactly. You know, saying like, now you're coming in encounter with the aliens. So like the terminology that we are the aliens you have to find, and we are the ones saving you, was part of the whole ironic avant-garde theater here. And yes. Obviously, the whole thing is, of course ambivalent. Of course it's clear. I mean, you cannot break representation, lack of representation, when you don't have a concept of identity politics. And obviously, when you want to change the thing, you have to find some point of identity politics. On the other hand, identity politics are very close connected to abstract identity labels, when you always kind of put into this box. And so what I want to do now is actually to go a little bit into academic discussions about those things. Because as I started out with Nelka Fogutan interview, she said, well, the art scene is kind of, they have the advantage that they don't have to define their concepts. They can just play with it, you know, and they do. They provoke, they play. What do we do as scientists with it? And it's actually those discussions that you're kind of raising, like, well, what kind of distinctions are we dealing with? That's then the question of how do we do this in scientists? How does it influence our view on those issues we're talking about? How can we, again, I say we can, but it's a question, can we reinvent migration research, migration studies as such? Because obviously there are methodological questions showing up here which are not easy to answer, I would say. So just very briefly to the academic reception, and now come to the second point here. The first academic reception was quite fast, and when I talk about reception, I mentioned that in the 90s the concept post-migration already showed up in some articles and whatever essays. That's not the point. What I'm talking about here is that researchers are directly influenced by the theater concept we're talking about here and using the concept in their own work. And one of the first ones is Nelka Fogutan, you already met her, Erol Ildes, professor in Salzburg, Fogutan professor at Humboldt University. They began to use the concept like in 2010, it started like two years after the big success of Ballhaus-Nonnenstraße. And the first thing they did, so they said like, well, the post-migrant thing is very much about empowerment, about maybe even identity politics. It's about the post-migrants who have not migrated themselves. That was the first reading in academic world. I have a lot of quotations. I think I stopped them. I mean, I kind of skipped them. But the thing they were doing, of course, was that we have to accept the multiple, the multiple belonging discussions, and we have to accept that people not belong one place, and we have to accept ambiguities. We have to accept ambivalences, and we have to, we have to stop the ascribed labels to telling people who have been growing up in this country in the third generation that they don't belong by calling them foreigners, which was common in Germany. I mean, I guess most of you know this back story here, guest worker migration, which is part of German history. Denmark would be the same, say like for 50 years or whatever it is, one keep on talking about those people as guests from both sides, so to speak. I mean, there was no integration politics until the end of the 90s in Germany. So whenever you kind of compare what people do with the refugee crisis today with guest worker integration problems showing up, which there are problems, of course, you can show them. Obviously you mix up things because there was no integration politics. There was no language courses, nothing. They were guests, they were leaving again. And so the children and grandchildren would be called foreigners when I was young in Germany, even though they were born in the country. That was kind of commonly accepted language at the time. Of course, this is what they're up against, obviously. I mean, just one comment more, going away from my things, but still one more comment. If somebody followed the German election thing, it was interesting that when Angela Merkel was asked about the refugee situation, and the first thing she would say, I'm not talking about what she's doing, that's a different story, but saying she would say, like, we have to remember they're all human beings. That's kind of Angela Merkel, humanity, while she's looking at every border and closing every border and everything. That's a different story afterwards now. But the next sentence is interesting. She said in the television interview, she said, well, the main thing we have to remember with the refugee crisis at the moment, crisis, whatever, refugee situation, is that we do not do the same mistakes again that we did with guest worker generations. So she really put the table, turned it around and looked at the government, the state, and said, well, we have to make integration politics from the beginning. So what they're doing, very simple, is using millions of euros for language courses, integration programs, education programs. All this has not been done for guest worker generation. So when the jobs disappeared in the industry, of course, those people had no education, no language skills, how could they ever into the in the working force again? But that's kind of a background story. That's actually not what I want to talk about. This is quite a known story.
So I just have, out of curiosity, Kanagatak, which is new to me. Basically, going back that far, I would imagine that, I'm from Berlin, that this may be entirely based on West Germany, the background. And one question is, how does it relate to activists in West Germany? And second, to what extent has that whole idea and movement integrated also the former East German?
Yeah, extremely interesting question. I mean, obviously, I didn't mention it, but it's true. This is a West German phenomenon. Those people are guest worker, not all of them. It's mixed backgrounds, kind of ethnic German background with part of the Kanagatak movement as well. They don't look for heritage, for backgrounds. But still, obviously, looking at numbers, a huge amount of those people involved had a kind of background from guest worker generation. That would be a West German phenomenon. They were living in West Berlin or coming to West Berlin. And some of them, actually also some of the people in the Ballhaus-Marienstraße group around that would come from West German cities like the Ruhrgebiet and whatever, who also had strong numbers of guest worker population. So it's not like whole German phenomenon. Interesting in this story is I don't think, as far as I can see, that they really reach out for East Germany at the moment, former East Germany. Yes, I don't think they're the same. There are different discussions in East Germany. There are a lot of things lacking at, civilization processes, discussions through decades. What is happening though in Gorki Theater and Ballhaus-Marienstraße still exists, very much reaching out for East Europe, which is very interesting. I mean, there have been like about 3 million immigrants coming from East Europe after 1990 to Germany. And they have been children now, they have been, experiences, and they're extremely much included in all those things. So it's not like a Turkish, Greek, or whatever guest work group. It's really manifold, it's different people's different backgrounds, including people from villages in East Germany, but they would kind of be part of the West Berlin, West Germany theater scene at the moment. So I think that's an interesting point, how they actually kind of reach out for the rest of Germany. I don't know what they actually do. But Germany is still very much dominated by West German approaches. It still is. Well, let me just go back to this. And the one thing I was saying that there was integration, the time is a bit running. But there was the first attempt, the academic reception was about reading them as post-migrant figures. This has been rejected quite fast in the academic discourse. It was the beginning in 2010 when Ildesnecker, Fota and others said, oh, well, we're talking about second generation here. Then people started to ask, well, if you talk about second generation, what do we win with the new label then? And we can just call them second generation immigrants. Why do we call them post-migrants? What do we win here? And so there was a kind of movement inside the academic discussions. There were actually groups founded discussing those things, like in academic, before they get professors. So they were saying like we have to broaden the perspective. And I personally think it's only then when it becomes interesting. Broadening the perspective means that we do not use anymore in the circles post-migration or post-migrant as a figure for the second generation immigrant. We're broadening the perspective in two directions, in the what people call the post-migrant perspective, analytical perspective, which is kind of taken away from subjectivities from person and having as a research academic perspective on society. And the second term would be the term of the post-migrant society that Nelke Vorotan lays. Nelke Vorotan kind of changed position on this. She started out, as I said, talking about the second generation immigrants as post-migrants. She's not doing it anymore. She's been convinced by all the others. So she would kind of reject this. Everybody in this discussion today rejects those kind of views. Maybe not everybody, but nearly everybody rejects the use of post-migrant as second generation. Because what they're doing now, what we are doing, and my research group as well, is that we're trying to use the term on a broader perspective, taking the perspective away from the focus on one group, on migrants, post-migrants, on their experience, and discuss the whole society in this matter out from a post-migrant perspective. I will shorten a little bit, I mean I have to shorten a little bit here, but I will go into one methodological discussion, which I think personally is kind of the heart of the whole thing here. This is a discussion about migrantology. Migrantology is a term that Regina Romhed, professor at Humboldt University as well, Regina Romhed has labeled the term, has coined the term migrantology as a critique against tendencies in migrant research, research on migrants, exactly because they say what we're doing is reproducing a picture that we're always kind of making research on a specific group in society. So I give you some quotes from her. She's referring to Nina Klick-Schiller, methodological ethnicity discussions, like kind of a methodological level, use concept of ethnicity to describe things. And then what we're doing is mainly in empirical research, is looking at specific groups, how do they perform in society. And of course the critique here is that when we look at specific groups, how they perform, then we reproduce the very notion that those groups are different from the rest of society. So we kind of build the demarcation lines that we actually want to break down. So I give you some quotations on this. Well, I mean, let's find the starting point here. She said, I mean, what she basically said, Regina Romhed, is that the problem is that even though we in our days, of course, perceive migrant worlds, I mean the migrant out there, as hybrid, diverse, diasporic identities. I mean, we are not so stupid anymore that we say like this is just the ethnic Turk. Nobody will say this. This is diverse hybridity and and different belongings, equal, and so on. Of course. But she said, even though we do this, and we means migration research here, even though, I mean, while we describe migrant life worlds as highlighted, as especially dynamic and mobile, they remain fixed on the periphery, on a special research area outside the ethnic, unmarked, immobile, mobile, and majority society. The underlying problem, she says, is that the migration research is often understood merely as a research about migrants, producing a migrantology that is capable of little more than repeatedly illustrating and reproducing itself. A migrantology that at the same time plays its part in constructing its supposed counterpart, the national society of immobile white non-migrants. And she concludes, and it continues here, what is lacking is not yet more research about migration, but a migration-based perspective to generate new insights into the constructed areas of society and culture. I understand this shift in a perspective as a fundamental change towards a post-migrant migration research. What this requires in the first place is reappropriate research domains, well, they have to redefine research domains that systematically transgress the bounds of the culturalized, ethnicized migrant worlds to enter the yet untouched majority society and institutions. Well, kind of stumbling with English language here. But what's at the point here, I made it before, as she said, as long as we continue to make migration research as research on the migrant, we'll reproduce the picture we have on the process of othering. So we have to open the perspective on society as such. This is what post-migrant research mainly kind of seeks to deliver. The post-migrant research that Naker Fortan is, among others, is focusing on is exactly doing this. She's saying now, in the last years, she said, we have to go away from singling out migrants and the others as a specific group. What we have to do is to take the look on the society as such and to discuss the processes, struggles, and conflicts in societies influenced by migration, of course. What Naker Fortan and her team is doing is publishing a couple of big reports, huge reports, Deutschland postmigrantisch 1, 2, 3, Schleswig-Holstein postmigrantisch, Berlin postmigrantisch. So they make kind of studies on how kind of the society as such kind of relates to issues on migration and othering and whatever. So it's important here to stress that post-migrant societies, and the way Fortan uses this, does not have overcome conflictual struggles for recognition and equality or anything. So it's not kind of a utopian harmonic state we're dealing with. On the opposite. The perspective on post-migrant societies would be to get the focus on the struggles, conflicts inside society as such, without kind of reducing it to one specific part of society. Obviously, the whole thing is then about breaking down the demarcation line between migrant and non-migrant. And of course, the post-migrant then refers to a temporal dimension, saying like, well, we have to understand that migration is not something coming as an exception now and kind of changing everything. Migration has always been there. So the post would then refer to, of course, in a historical dimension, one of it. That's why I would use the term post-migration, by the way. Migration is something that's always been there. Like it has always been as a part of our societies, and so we cannot even understand society if we don't understand, if we kind of exclude the dimension, meaning that all the society is built on migration already. That also means that new migration movements are just normalities that we always are dealing with in post-migrant societies, with all different conflicts and problems and everything. This is, of course, a small shift in perspective, but I would see a decisive shift, because it's not kind of saying we have a stable, sedentary regroup of homogeneous, Danish, white, whatever, who has to deal with the other coming from outside. But the regroup as such has been redefined here. We're talking about that the regroup from the beginning is diverse through migration movements, and that means that the challenges, the struggles we're dealing with, the conflicts we're dealing with, are inside a diverse regroup and not a problem between the regroup and the other. So that means, of course, taking the next step in this would mean that the integration logic that people say would be rejected in those groups. Of course, integration in the old-fashioned term would be something that we have to deny. And that wouldn't say that people should not integrate, but the logic of integration in its traditional form would presuppose that we have a regroup who has not to do anything, and the other group who has to make the integration work. So the other coming from outside has to integrate in what already exists as a kind of normative, whatever you call it, regroup. So they would say, if we talk about, some in the field would say we have completely get lost, throw this term away, don't talk about integration anymore, it's really failure. Others would say, now we have to redefine it. We have to redefine integration and open it for kind of a complex mechanism where everybody in society is involved in integration processes, and not, again, singling out one group, not coming back to some kind of migrantology where the other out there has to do the integration work. Obviously, you can see, at least those of you living in Denmark, and also Germany, by the way, you can easily see that this is on a political level, when we talk about political discourse, that is not yet accepted, so to speak. I mean, today, like everything is about in political discourse, it's about how the other out there, the immigrant and descendant and descendant and descendant, how do they integrate in our wonderful, perfect Danish society. And obviously this is kind of challenging the whole concept behind it, and saying we have to get rid of this logic behind it. We have to understand that the weak group is already diverse, and those people have to integrate a part of the weak group. So we have to find solutions together how to deal with each other. That means, of course, that we have to redefine also questions of color, racism, and everything. I mean, not redefine racism, but we have to redefine the struggles behind it. We have to understand that kind of people of color would be a normal part of our post-migrant societies, obviously. I mean, it's kind of clear point, but in politics it's not clear. In public discourse it's not clear. That's where they're kind of pushing there. Well, I had some other points here, but I just, time is up, I think, more or less. I can feel like Yeah. I give you one quotation in the end, which is somehow more an empirical, not a perspective discussion. It's Esther Kütschig. Esther Kütschig is part of the Gorky Forum. She's director of the Gorky Forum. The Gorky Forum is part of the Gorky Theater in Berlin when they try to get together, build an interface between art and academic political discourses. And she's the one in head of this kind of group inside the Gorky Theater. A strong person, is great. And, and she once gave a speech, not a speech, but the one speech the lecture I want to refer to, was kind of published in Zeit and whatever in Germany. It's called on the Courage of Having No Fear, von Mut keine Angst zu haben. She started out telling that when she was invited by the Zeit Forum, whatever, the weekly newspaper, the Zeit, like she was invited to give a speech. But what I want to do now, what I wanted to do, she told, was of course giving a speech on something else. She wanted to give a speech on the experience of marginalization, of racism, of whatever, xenophobia, and kind of talking representation politics. And then she said, no, actually I don't want to speak about this anymore, because if I do speak about this, then you see me as a representative of a minority group again, claiming anything, and that would again reaffirm the whole concept of, othering and us and them. So I'm not going to speak about this, she said. Even though, of course, she would say I have Turkish background and whatever, and of course I'm kind of proud of it and whatever. But that's not what I want to talk about. So she then talked about the new complexity. And like everybody has talked about complexity for years, so complexity is nothing new. But she said there's a complexity in relation to the discussion about migration and non-migration and all those things. And this complexity is not yet acknowledged, it's not yet recognized. What we are, in public discourse at least, seeing as that demarcation line, the distinction between migrant and non-migrant, seems to be an explanation for things going on in the world. Like this is explanation line we're using. And she said that doesn't work. We have to kind of redefine those things. And I'll just give you a quotation here, quite long quotation from here, and then kind of stop and open for discussion. Obviously one point in the discussion could be, I would feel like, how this concept and how this thing what we are doing in our group, gets an cross-disciplinary approach in it. This is social sciences, humanities, one could even say natural sciences coming together in this kind of thing. It's kind of obvious that that's where we are meeting in this field. So I'll give you this quotation, which is, just a lecture, it's good. The distinctions and conflicts no longer run along the old proven demarcation lines, right versus left, migrant versus non-migrant, down versus above. The lines of conflicts, as we know them, are more and more dissolving. It becomes more difficult to recognize the antagonism. Gegensätze, he said. Suddenly, left-wing intellectuals want to reverse the double citizenship. Suddenly, migrants can also be Nazis and run to a Munich shopping center to assassinate Turks. This is a kind of anecdote she refers to, which was happening, I think it was last year in Germany, when a person with Iranian background would define himself as an Aryan, Iran Aryan, that's kind of Nazi terminology, and going around and killing the Turks because they were foreigners, and he would be an Aryan, whatever. Interesting discussion about the whole event happening in Munich. It's not labeled as terrorism because, of course, that's right-wing, so we don't label it as terrorism. But interesting, of course, the migration background plays in here. And when you discuss with people from the Iranian community about it, a lot of researchers, Forutan, Kianas Barangizi, Asari Sharifi, they all have Iranian background, many of them. They kind of figure out that there's actually a problem going on in the community, defining themselves as superior to other immigration groups and so on. A different story, but that's what she refers to here. So sorry for disrupting. Suddenly, left-wing intellectuals want to reverse the double citizenship. Suddenly, migrants can also be Nazis and run to a Munich shopping center to assassinate Turks. Suddenly, conservatives start to help refugees. The Dome post in Cologne turns off the light when Pegida demonstrates in Dresden. My grandmother began to curse when she meets a woman with a headscarf on the street. She can curse, my grandmother. My Turkish taxi driver is afraid that refugees will take his work away from him. My feminist neighbor is wearing a headscarf and subscribes to Missy magazine. The conservative suburban family smears sandwiches for refugees at the train station. Conservative business associations are working to ban deportations of refugees who are in education, and so on. So the whole point here, of course, is making is that when we have this complexity in the world, then we cannot explain this complexity against old-fashioned concepts like migrant or non-migrant or different distinction lines. It's much more complex here. So what she is saying, actually referring back to Kanaka, indirectly would then be Haltung statt Herkunft. We have to talk about attitudes toward an open society, and that would be kind of independent from where you come from. It's not about Herkunft, but about Haltung, not about origin, but about attitude, positioning. So I stop here. Thank you for the patience.
Yeah, I think we still have time for some questions and short remarks. Francesco?
I find it very fascinating. Sorry, I find it very fascinating and interesting. Being a migrant myself here, so technically in the States here, I recognize a number of these things you just said, right? But there's also, as you say at the end, right? There's also the fact that there is a society already there, and you enter in a society. Right? So as a migrant, you're actually entering another society. So which also means you yourself have to kind of be ready to accept you're not a migrant, which is not easy to do. Right? So I think you're seeing it from the perspective of the local place. But there is also the migrant himself or herself that comes to a new society. And that depends also how open they are to that. And that is also a discussion that's not typically not incredibly taken. And the second thing is that not many people have experience abroad from the society you get into. So there is a huge level of being provincial because you actually never left the place. So you don't know what it means being a migrant either. So there are these two things which are typically never really addressed, right? What does it mean being a migrant? Because you never experienced that. Nor what is from the migrants to actually adjust to the society you get in. So how do you see that?
I mean, mainly I see, of course, the adjustment process is going on. Obviously, when people coming from outside with different backgrounds and kind of socialization and languages and everything, of course, there's adjustment process going on. I think the main thing here is whether you believe that this adjustment process is kind of going towards a pre-existing homogeneous group that you enter. And this is actually the thing that they kind of struggle with. I mean, they're saying, this is not so easy. I mean, this group in itself is diverse and built on migration, which is kind of a simple point, you know, it's not a big thing. But the simple point changes the perspective, and as I said, for me in a decisive way. And that also means, like when you talk with Syrian refugees in Berlin at the moment, I mean, they are part of the society. And even though they're part of society with language skills which would be different from others, they're part of it. And post-migrant society perspective would then try to kind of locate what's going on in kind of, you know, interactions, conflicts, you know, meetings, whatever. But not singling out like there's a one and here's a group and then we have to see how's the adjustment going on. Like when I visit recently Berlin, I come from Berlin myself, so I have migrant experience. I know process of othering very good. I mean, as a German in Denmark, you're very much confronted with not being a Dane, very much. And then you try to overtake it, internalize it, and reject Denmark and everything. And I was happy about Danish football once, I'm not anymore. They never come back. I mean, they kind of destroyed it for me.
You mean 1982?
Yeah, but it's because I always told me I don't belong. I mean, I always heard I don't belong, you know. And not anymore now, maybe, but I heard it for years. And so you start to build your own resistance. I understand people, I even understand radicalization processes somehow. Yeah. They're part of othering process, partly, not only, but it's true. But when I recently was back in Berlin, you know, sitting together with some refugees, actually Syrian refugee, Afghan refugee, my Danish wife, Italian former lover of my wife and whatever, you know, sitting together. I mean, the ones who were best in speaking German besides me and my family would be the refugees from Syria. The Afghan would not be able to speak anything, he just arrived. The Italian ex-lover would not be able to understand anything, not even English. You know, my wife being married to me.
Italian, so I need to be.
No, great person, but not understanding anything. You know, my wife, after 20 years together with me, would not speak a single word German, but understand everything. My son would, you know, whatever. You could continue. Yeah, this group was so diverse in it that you cannot just say there's adjustment going on by the refugee. The refugees were more integrated than, you know, than other people who had been in contact with Germany for 20 years. And of course, in other perspectives you take, then they would not be integrated. I mean, of course, there would be kind of different perspectives what you take. They talked with my Turkish-born, you know, brother-in-law about the experience of being hidden in school. I mean, you're beaten up in school. Experience I don't have. I grew up in Germany. The Turkish brother-in-law for me, Turkish-born, now German brother-in-law, it's a Syrian refugee. They talked about a common experience that I don't have. Of course there are differences, but those differences can be discussed and opened up without saying, you are there and I'm here, and no, you have to come to me. You know, it's broadening up the complexity. That's actually what it's about. And it's opening interesting questions and not even solutions. Maybe it's the first time in my career as academics I don't have answers. You know, normally you kind of find some answer and oh, it's here where I want to go. I don't have answers. I mean, it's really an open field. I think it's great. It's really, really great.
There's several comments now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yes, quick one. How did Ballhaus-Naunenstraße and Gorki influence the Leipzig theatre scene? Because in Leipzig you have a more classic division line between left and right, and classic you are different via the sex zones. Do you have any data on that?
Actually, I have no idea, but I guess there are a lot of people who know about it. I just don't know about the Leipzig theatre scene. I know, of course, that this would be seen as leftist avant-gardistic theatre. And obviously that would also be a demarcation line again, that some people would say this is just, you know, leftist avant-garde theatre, don't go there. But still, it's one of the major institutions, the Gorki theatre. Small theatre, but still. So it's in the Unter den Linden, you know, just beside the Deutsche Historische Museum. That's a huge institution, center of Berlin, center of the power of Germany, so to speak. So it's not marginalized anymore. But I don't know exactly how it continues in, you know, different, Leipzig would be one example. Also different other areas in Germany. I don't know exactly how the kind of development is. They had huge influence because they break up the boundaries, the barriers against, you know, the main institutions. They managed to come on the front page easily, front page of Theater Heute, which is the main journal, you know. Gorki Theater has been in 14 and 16 elected as Germany's Theater of the Year by the critics, you know. This is amazing. Just 2 years after they took over, 2 years they have been chosen for the most important theater in whole Germany. They broke the boundaries, the barriers, you know, they came into this institution. But of course, the question would then be, how would it be in the other field? And of course, there's one danger in it, would be that they would be kind of the model everybody can point at. While diversity work, people of color in theater, oh, we have the Gorki, you know, and the Ballhaus is still existing, doing good work, you know. So we don't have to do anything else in the other theaters, or whatever, cultural institution. That's a real problem.
Yeah.
And we have to remember, that in Germany, until recently, it was still nearly not unseen that people of color would play Shakespeare or whatever, you know, Kangler or whatever, which would be maybe different in the UK, for example. But in Germany, it was really, you have to break into that and make sure that you can have different roles with different colors and whatever, you know, they're doing it. Sorry.
Yeah, very short questions and very short answers. Patrick.
I want to ask you about this argument that you came back to a couple of times, this claim that the methods of studying for migration can't reinforce the problem that they're supposed to solve. There is a theory of knowledge that I think you're relying on that I'd like it if you could try to explain. Because that particular premise, there would be lots of other fields of study where that wouldn't make any sense. No one thinks that my methods of studying stars reinforce the existence of stars. By studying the oceans, I don't reinforce the existence of oceans. So why is it the case that when I'm studying, well, maybe you want to dispute that.
Not today.
So why is it the case that the ways I study migration are so susceptible to reinforcing the issue, why is the way I study it and the thing that I'm studying permeable in this instance?
Yeah, I think maybe one should dispute the major thing you said.
Okay.
It's not kind of problematic in other situations. I think what we, at least when you come from humanities and partly social research, I mean, I think background in social sciences, so kind of I'm being in between, but I think you understand quite fast how concepts shape the world, you know. And even though I would agree on there's water out there and the ocean and so on, of course the way we speak about the ocean also in research shapes the reality, the way we're looking at the world. I think we could agree on this at some point. Finish your back. But just to make the argument here is that, of course, when you go into fields like social constructions of identities, like migrants, non-migrants, and so on, then of course you're shaping a lived reality and political reality for people. I mean, this is maybe also different to natural sciences and talking about the ocean and salt and whatever, you know. Here we're talking about that people are labeled to being something for their whole life. And growing up in, I mean, those people, Schramm and Langhoff, growing up in Germany, I mean, at least you came as a child, then being socialized in Germany, and all the time hearing you don't belong, you're a foreigner and so on. That's through the label of the migrant. And then we go to the methodological level, on a research level, and Regina Remmelt, among others, would argue that, well, we're doing exactly the same as researchers. doing exactly the same by singling out a pre-concept. We're having a pre-concept of the migrant, and in this migrant we already kind of put a lot of different values into it, what this migrant is about, and then we go out there and define the group and look at it. And so we reproduce. The interesting part of this is, of course, when you do this, migrantology, as she calls it, and I think there's just an agenda to break it up because people are kind of suffering under these labels, and so of course it's getting into methodological then. But when you do migrantology, then you have to define who's the migrant, which is extremely interesting. I mean, I tried to compare Germany and Denmark. Extremely funny stuff. Try to compare. Just a simple point, which country is more diverse? Diverse is so great. Nobody can tell me. I cannot tell. The statistics saying that in Germany, every fifth person, like 22%, have migration background. In Denmark, 7%. So, great. Germany is more diverse. It's nonsense, because they're using different definitions. And when you try to compare the definitions of who has a migration background, you understand that Danish definitions is much more kind of, you're much easier part of Denmark than in Germany. So I did kind of the idea of comparing, because nobody, I was in contact with the Statistics Bureau in Denmark to tell me, if you use the German definition, what would be the result in Denmark would be. If you use, they said, I cannot tell you. We cannot use the definition, we have no numbers on it. Yeah, they accept the different definitions, they cannot use the numbers. They cannot give me the numbers. So I did kind of very simple, went to the school of my son, 2 schools actually, in Österbro, some of you may know, white area, I looked at the German definition in the class. I know the parents somehow, looked at the background. Danish definition would give me like 3%, like one out of 30 more or less, has a migration background. German definition, the same people would be like 40%, 35% to be honest, migration background. Completely different numbers, because different definitions. I did the same thing in a small school in outside, on the countryside where we're living at the moment. Same thing, 10% from a Danish perspective, 45% from a German perspective, on a small island outside the metropole, Completely different definitions. So when you start to use migrantology, talking about the migrant out there, then you use definitions as constructing the world who the migrant is. Because migrant would be the descendant, even the descendant of the descendant in some definitions. So you have to define it. And then of course when you define it, then the results of your, that's kind of accepted. The result of your research is of course bound to the definition you used in the beginning. I mean, when you kind of include like half of the population with migration background, then obviously they will quite match the rest of the population. When you single out a little group, then obviously you have a lot of problems in this group. I mean, it's kind of, whatever. There's consequences how you define those groups. So people like Omid would see, well, this is a political problem we're dealing with, and it's an academic problem. We cannot use those definitions. I mean, at least not so easily.
Well, friends and colleagues, thank you very much. Thank you, Moritz, for an excellent lecture. Thank you for all your enthusiastic questions, and there are still more, but we can't reach it today. But yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you for the lecture.